So, hello and welcome to the SPARCC Virtual Learning Conversation on Engaging for Equity in a World of COVID-19. I'm Ella Mendonça, the SPARCC Community of Practice Coordinator, and we're all joining from various cities, spaces, and frames of mind. Some people might be joining from other calls, some coming from childcare, not feeling well, or just really excited and ready to go. If you're on your computer, you should see a poll on your screen asking you how you're coming into the call. That'll be there in about a minute. And then once that's up, you can just take a few minutes and answer that poll. This is a great time to kind of get settled and test out your video. We have over 100 participants today. And with this many attendees on the call, we're going to keep folks muted until we get started and opened up for Q&A and then the breakout sessions. So to share with the group or individual, you're welcome to utilize the chat function. If you have a question or having any trouble navigating any logistics issues, you're welcome to raise your Zoom hand or chat message Nick Collins and myself. To raise your hand in Zoom, you're going to want to click on the participant tab at the bottom. You'll see a little button at the bottom that says raise hand, and you can use that. The chat box is also down there under the More tab. And if you go to Gallery View, you can see all of our videos and not just the slides. I know some of you are new to SPARCC. SPARCC is the Strong, Prosperous, and Resilient Communities Challenge, a multi-year initiative investing in and amplifying local efforts underway in 6 regions to ensure that new investments reduce racial disparities, build a culture of health, and prepare for a changing climate. The initiative's long-term goal is to change the way metropolitan regions grow, invest, and build through integrated, cross-sector approaches that benefit low-income people and communities of color. We work with amazing local partners doing the on-the-ground work in 6 cities and regions: Transformation Alliance in Atlanta, Mile High Connects in Denver, Elevated Chicago in Chicago, Neighborhood Collaborative for Resilience in Memphis, Bay Area for All in the San Francisco Bay Area, and ACT LA in Los Angeles. Our national partners are the Natural Resources Defense Council, Low Income Investment Fund, and Enterprise Community Partners. I'm going to share some quick reminders on best practices, and then we're going to hear from our featured speaker, Maria Zimmerman, on how inclusive investment starts with equitable engagement with Q&A, and then we'll open up the discussion groups for about 30 minutes and come back together for a share out. The discussion groups are a great place to brainstorm and uplift models you're working on locally and learn about what others are also doing in the space.
And Ella, we just learned in the chat that if you're on the phone, you can raise your hand by typing *9 so that we know you would like to speak, and then we can unmute you.
That's so helpful and great to know.
And thank you, whoever is Park Pride.
So during this call, particularly during the breakout session, we have some best practices. It's helpful to keep your camera on if possible, particularly for our Q&A portion and breakout sessions, and assume best intentions of the group you're in. Ask for clarification if you're unsure of something, and be thoughtful about how much you're speaking in your breakout group. Please make sure to leave room for others to participate and collaborate as well. The VLC is part presentation, but is really intended to be for conversation and discussion of the work that's happening on the local level. And please be thoughtful of where you're coming from, your privilege, your power, and your organizations as well. Mute when you're not trying to speak and utilize the chat function in the meantime. We are going to save what comes up in the chat and share it out in the follow-up. So please feel free to share resources or links that you'd like to share out with the group at any point during the call. And remember, even individual chats to other members aren't private and will be downloaded at the end of the call. If at any point you need to get up and stretch or walk around, take a bio break, you're welcome to turn off your camera and do just that, and then return to the call. So I know a lot of folks are very new to SPARCC, and the VLC for us is actually pretty recent. We aired our first virtual learning conversation just last year. Since its formation in 2017, SPARCC has really had a North Star to help shift decades of racially discriminatory policies and investments that have resulted in harmful disparities in health and climate resilience in communities in the United States. SPARCC's effort to address the barriers facing communities of color and low-income neighborhoods has meant advancing a community-driven development model. And after 3 years, we've learned some very important lessons. These lessons feel even more important in light of the unfolding COVID-19 pandemic, which is disproportionately affecting communities of color. We know that engagement with a marginalized community is even harder than it was before the pandemic, and that marginalized communities are even further impacted during this time. SPARCC's principles of inclusive development include prioritizing processes and outcomes on racial inclusion, deciphering the power dynamics of who benefits, who pays, and who decides. Equitable community-led engagement is a key strategy to deciphering and shifting these power dynamics to achieve system change and community agency. Community engagement once meant external experts informing local residents, but this has really shifted and the bar has been raised for what we acknowledge to be true. We believe that local residents are experts in their own lived experiences and their community. That communities should have the agency to define and co-design their own future. We believe the true community engagement, that's a mouthful, is not just a buzzword, but requires a power shift, recentering community and community members at the heart of its process. So while engaging for equity is a topic we chose before the COVID-19 pandemic, the principles and practices are even now more important to our work than before. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in and introduce our phenomenal speaker and author of SPARCC White Paper, Inclusive Investment Starts with Equitable Engagement, Maria Zimmerman. Maria is the founder and principal of MZ Strategies, a woman-owned small business located in Richmond, Virginia, that works with communities around the country to create more inclusive and strong communities. She's been a SPARCC collaborator since SPARCC was founded, and supports the team with a number of policy and engagement issues, particularly around equitable community development, equitable community engagement, and transit-oriented development. And so I'll hand it off to Maria. Thank you.
Thanks, Ella. Thanks for those kind words. So before I jump into kind of my formal remarks, we would like to do another poll, not centered on chocolate, but equally important. So as Ella mentioned, we're going to have a big chunk of the time of the VLC is going to be for breakout groups, for conversation. That's the C in virtual learning, conversation. And so my comments will really be to kind of key us up for that. But we would like to hear from you which of the 6 breakout groups you're most interested in being part of. These 6 topics were created by input from our amazing planning committee that helped us coordinate and get ready for today's virtual learning conversation. I will read these out quickly for our folks who are on the phone, and also a heads up to folks on the phone. If you want to write down the topic that is of interest to you when we get to the breakout portion, Nick's going to stay on and help put you into the room that you want to be part of that conversation. For those of you who are online, you will see the poll pop up here in just a minute or two, and click the group that you want to be in, and we will do our best to make sure that you get in that group. We have a fabulously larger audience than we were expecting, so we will do our best to make sure people can get where they are, but we might need to do a little adjustment. So very quickly, those 6 breakout topics. One is organizing ourselves virtually for advocacy, and this is really noting a lot of the work that we do is cross-sector coalition work. Usually we're sitting around the table with each other and we're talking through these issues together collectively, and so this is really to talk about how do we continue to do this important work of coalition building and advocacy work in a cross-sector fashion when we can't physically be together. And even going forward, how do we think about some of these new technology tools and how they'll help us be even better at our work in a post-COVID world. The second topic is online public engagement to inform government plans and programs. We're seeing lots of government agencies do online town hall meetings and broadcasting their city council meetings and providing information online for comment. In some ways, we're seeing more transparency than we had before, but we also know the digital divide is very real. If you're a non-English speaker, it's very hard to access those things. So having conversation about what are some great practices, what are some concerns, and how can we do better. The third group will talk about bringing transparency to budgetary decisions. We are in budget season, and the budgets that mayors or governors released at the beginning of March are obsolete in many ways as we face unprecedented loss of revenue and demand for more services. So how can we ensure as budgets are being readjusted that community-based organizations, those with greatest needs, are really seeing their needs prioritized in these new budgets? The next breakout group, virtual door knocking and community care. Again, a lot of our advocacy work has been kind of hand-to-hand, door-to-door, working to organize community members. Now we're seeing that same network, that same strategy. How do we care for one another? What are some of the ways that we're using new technology tools and engagement tools to do that important work? Fifth topic, community-based engagement intermediaries. That's a mouthful, but it's basically noting we believe in community-based organizations as a great way to do community engagement. They are closer to community, they have networks with community, they have local expertise. How do we ensure that those community-based organizations are part of both short-term and long-term engagement processes, particularly that the public and the private sectors are supporting? And last but not least is engaging for bricks and mortar. There are many requirements in most cities around the country that there be some level of public notice for development projects, for infrastructure projects. How could we ensure that this work continues, is transparent, and is equitably engaging the communities who are most involved? This is something we struggle with even when we're not virtual, so kind of a double challenge for that. So those are the 6 groups. If you haven't voted, vote is closing, so please do so now. Again, if you're on the phone, we will recap those 6 when we open up at the break group if you didn't catch them all, or they're on the agenda if you received that. Alrighty, so now I'm going to move to the formal part of the discussion. So as Ella mentioned, I'll be sharing some really high-level conversations from or findings from our report that was released in December. There should be in the chat room a link to this. Feel free to peruse it while I'm talking, look at it in greater detail afterwards. It provides a lot more information about a lot of examples from around the country, a lot of resource links that you can check out as well. And I apologize, there may be important chats coming my way and I'm just not seeing them. Okay, I'm just pulling that up right now. Okay, so let me, there we go. I think I solved that issue. Thanks for the heads up. Sorry, hard to multitask here. Okay, so this white paper really came about because our sites were really wanting to know what were some best practices, were there standards out there of what does equitable engagement look like and how to do this work. And we found, as I know many of you have also found this International Association for Public Participation to be a great resource. If you haven't checked out their website, please do. They've got lots of information, including the spectrum of public participation, which is shown here. And the idea with the spectrum is really to recognize there's not one size fits all for public engagement, first of all. So it's not that everything has to be on the far right of the engagement spectrum, but it is a spectrum, and I think it should be calibrated as you're thinking about, you know, what's the level of investment? Is this a multi-million-dollar investment? Is it a 20-year plan you're working on? Who's going to be impacted and how impacted are they? So how are we involving the community in it? There may be things where it's fine to just inform or to post and request comment, but a lot of our work really is more centered in involving, collaborating, and shared power, shared ownership. And so if we think about, you know, some of the work, for instance, that our public sector allies have been doing to create longer, more continuous processes to get that public engagement, to check with the public, to inform the plan, to inform the process. That's really about involvement. If we look at collaboration, that's where we begin to share some of that decision making, some of that power. So that could be creating committees or commissions or different groups where members of the community are actually in decision making seats to be able to influence what we're working on. It could be the community-based organizations who are helping to lead and inform the engagement that we talked about. And then sharing power, sharing ownership. You know, I think about something like a community land trust where you actually have residents and you have funders and other partners who are equally sitting at the table and making decisions. Other examples that kind of show how do we get in that shared ownership model. Some of our SPARCC collaboratives definitely sit at that intersection of shared power. So while this is a great spectrum, it doesn't necessarily, I shouldn't say it doesn't really ground that work around a racial equity framework. And so we at SPARCC wanted to think about, well, what does it mean? What does it look like if we're really centering engagement with an eye towards equity? And one of the kind of first and most critical issues is to think about whose priorities. In many communities, communities of color and grassroots leaders feel that the process was instigated by outsiders. And the problem statement was instigated by outsiders. It's not reflective of what the community needs are. I think this, you know, this is kind of unavoidable in some ways because we have transportation plans, we have comprehensive plans, we have all these different planning things that we're required to do a community engagement process on. But if we come to the community and we say, hey, we have this really important thing and we want you to focus on it and be part of the process, we're failing to recognize the community probably for many years has been pretty clear in what their concerns and their needs and their priorities are. So how do we kind of flip that to see how are we designing our processes? How are we defining the problems? So we're really being cognizant and centering it on community need, particularly when oftentimes that community concern is around segregation, around the lack of integration, around the lack of equitable access to opportunity or housing stability. So we still can end up with the same outcome of a great transportation project or a stormwater project or a great plan, but by reframing it around whose priorities really matter and how we define community, we can get a different process and a different outcome. Part of this is also creating equal power and thinking about how we use language, and a shout out here to Elevated Chicago, who created a set of engagement principles that really speaks to, we all bring our own power and our own privilege into these conversations. So how do we recognize that? How do we recognize who's not part of these conversations and how can we involve them in it? How do we see language as a barrier, not just for non-English speakers, but a lot of times planning processes or projects where we're doing engagement, it's technical, and we use that technical language, you know, air pollution standards or housing finance or levels of service. These are all barriers to say, you know, who we think has the expertise and who has the knowledge, rather than recognizing we can break these things down, we can translate them, we can meet people where we're at in a way that more authentically grounds and acknowledges the community expertise that is sitting around our tables in our neighborhoods. And absolutely important that we acknowledge history and racism. This is fundamental to engaging for equity. We know communities of color have often not been included in conversations, or worse, when they are included, they're still not listened to, or their needs are not prioritized, or they're marginalized, or in government investments and plans have led to gentrification, segregation, there's a long history of community trauma. And so how do we use the engagement process, not just for an outcome that can be a more equitable outcome, but seeing the process as really an opportunity for reparations, for some of the community healing, the brave conversations that need to happen to really show that this is a beloved community and all members are beloved, and the process is equally important. So we think doing these different fundamentals and creating clear accountability and shared understanding does lead to better outcomes, leads to a better process. We should be honest with our methodology of who was involved, who wasn't involved, what are our processes to continue engagement and continue to hear from people moving forward. If we fail to meet our challenges, or if we fail to meet our goals and outcomes, what's the point for pivoting or restructuring that? The white paper talks a lot about some of the better outcomes, whether it's reduced time and cost from a process where people are involved up front, so they're not coming in at the last minute to object because they haven't been part of the process, but really feeling that sense of ownership. We talk about better outcomes in terms of a project that isn't just trying to meet one need, but is really designed to meet multiple community needs. That may also allow it to leverage multiple financing resources or implementation resources. And another community benefit that I don't think we talk about as much is really how doing this process and building long-term relationships and building that long-term trust helps us to be more resilient communities. We have those networks in place. So when something like COVID-19 comes, we have a network we can call on, we can come together. We've built that trust and relationship to identify the needs that we have. So really quickly, we'll just go through some quick examples. So first off is, making your commitment, putting it in writing, making your statement to engaging for equity. And here's just a few examples, whether it's coming from nonprofits and community partners, whether it's coming from government, like there's a blueprint for equitable engagement that the city of Minneapolis created that really point by point walks through how the city's going to walk the talk, or if it's providing tools that are also showing how to do this work and how to engage in this work. Secondly, okay, you've said you want to commit to this new process. How do you actually begin to implement it? And putting in place policy levers, whether it's you're going to pass a new bonding measure, as they did in LA, and saying, hey, as part of a condition for increasing funding for parks and open space, we want to make sure that there is a base requirement and set of funding that's specifically for community-based organizations and local engagement activities to occur. It can be in creating an equity screen. If you're looking online, there's a slide here showing a scorecard out of King County, Washington, where they really are evaluating each project for infrastructure project when it comes in, not just for how stakeholders were partnered and collaborating in the process, which you see in one of the boxes, but you see community engagement woven throughout here in a sense of community ownership as well, in terms of community benefits and economic justice and local hiring. So creating those screens for how you're evaluating projects, what you're requiring around this, thinking about the protocols that you're putting in place that again are conveying this is the expectation that yes, community will be engaged, that we have a commitment to engaging those who have been underrepresented in past processes, and that we are providing the resources for those who may have a harder time to engage in the process. So it's not just equality, it's really about equity. So putting your money where your mouth is a pretty powerful way to do this. We found, unfortunately, in the research, there is no standard for what percentage folks are putting towards community engagement, but we can write the next chapter here with the SPARCC network and really move that forward. But there are some great examples. One of these is thinking about the procurement process, how RFPs are written to ensure that they include different requirements. It could be that there's an expectation if you're going to hire a consultant, make sure that that consultant has a portion of their budget, or they're coming back with a proposal that really will speak to how local community voices are being resourced and included and sharing that decision-making process with them. It could be, rather than hiring an outside consultant, you're designing an RFP so nonprofits could be competitive, and that may mean maybe you do it as a grant instead of an RFP. It can be a whole host of ways to get at that. We talk about those in the white paper. Another thing I want to flag quickly is the participatory budgeting process. This is a great tool that can bring transparency. Again, it's kind of getting towards that more shared ownership with community to set budget priorities, to look at trade-offs, to help in allocating resources. So all of this is really critical. And last but not least, how we begin to design and fund engagement appropriate to the needs. So again, thinking about, you know, we often hear and we often feel as community members, it can be exhausting. Nobody wants to be part of a process that's going to go on for 3 years and you feel like nothing changed as being part of that process. So how do we do it in a way that's really aligning and being clear of where and when we need to involve community? Is there ways that, again, we can design it so it's less that it's a government-led initiative, but a government partnership with those community-based organizations that are building capacity, building their networks, building their proficiency. This does involve adequately funding the work. Another thing we found is, you know, very few places sufficiently fund community engagement. So how do we, again, start to see the benefit and realign the resources? Whether that's funding for outside groups to do engagement, or it's funding for training for our own public agency staff or our nonprofit staff to have the cultural competency and the facilitation skills to do this work. How are we creating metrics to stretch ourselves to then look at how we can design new processes to meet those metrics, and how do we hold ourselves accountable when we fail? And repivot and readjust that. So lots of different strategies. We are in this virtual moment. So as mentioned, you know, we are seeing lots of examples of online engagement. We would love, you know, add to the chat box if you have been part of something that you think has been a great way of doing virtual community engagement. If you've seen it from your public sector, if you yourself have been part of that effort, we'd love to hear those stories. Ella will put into the chat box, and I see lots of folks are putting your group here into the chat box as well. But Ella's going to type in a couple of links I want to flag. One is SPARCC. Thanks to our partners who've been sending us lots of great examples before today. We've created kind of a folder with a bunch of information around resources for kind of navigating this COVID-19 world, whether it's different, you know, website platforms, meeting platforms, program management platforms, or different strategies and the like. Ella will also put in a link. One of our partners, Odin Zachman, who's on the call, has been doing some great work of thinking about how do we facilitate meetings, how do we ensure that we can have brave conversations and brave spaces to do this work, how do we think about engagement with an eye towards equity. So the two resources Ella will be putting in are both great. We will share those afterwards as well, so don't feel if you didn't get it in the chat box, it's gone. We will circulate that afterwards, but wanted to call those out. And then I will pause. I know I've been talking fast and furiously, but I will pause so we can hear from some of our SPARCC partners who very briefly are just going to share kind of what this work looks like in their communities, especially at this moment in time when things are pivoting and shifting quickly. So first we'll hear from Shay Stevens, who's with the Center for Transforming Communities out of Memphis with the Neighborhood Collaborative for Resilience there. So hopefully this works. Nick, you can unmute Shay and we'll hear from Shay, and then we'll hear from a couple of folks after Shay too.
Sure. Maria, I also gave you co-host, so you might be able to unmute, but I'll look for Shay.
Okay.
And I know, Justin, you were hoping to share some slides, so if you wanted to put those up, you're welcome to.
Oh, Shay, you should be unmuted now.
Shay's got her hands full at the minute, I can see.
I think she remuted. Bad timing on our part.
Sure, we can hear you if you're.
And you hear my child. Hi.
Yes.
He's on the call. Go and talk about our work.
We can come back in a minute, Shay. We will. I have kids of my own. I could totally get it if you need a minute. Why don't we turn to Roberto and then we'll come back to Shay. Roberto Requejo with Elevated Chicago. Do you want to share with us some of your work happening there, Roberto?
Sure, and thank you, Maria and Ella, and thank you everyone for joining this webinar. I said there's over 100 people. Wow. So anyway, I think a lot of you know Elevated Chicago. We are a collaborative of community-based organizations and regional partners advancing equitable transit-oriented development, or ETOD, in Chicago, and addressing inequities in public health, in climate resiliency, in arts and culture, and stopping displacement and depopulation in our communities of color. And from day one, we knew that apart from engaging communities on bricks and mortar and place-based projects, we also had to work hard on systems change. So in addition to supporting affordable housing and business incubators and health clinics and community centers near transit, we also work very closely with the City of Chicago, the Mayor's Office, to amend the city's transit-oriented development ordinance in 2019. And the new ordinance now requires the creation of an equitable policy plan. So future TOD in Chicago is built with authentic community engagement and addresses inequities both in disinvested areas and in gentrifying communities. So great opportunity. We all came together and we realized that in order to create this equitable policy plan, we had to have a very collaborative relationship with a lot of people. So starting with the Mayor's Office and the City Department of Planning, of Housing, of Transportation, with the Chicago Transit Authority, other government agencies. And also we had to bring together a group of folks who were part of Elevated Chicago in the steering committee or were equitable development advocates. So we have brought to the table about a dozen civic groups and neighborhood-based organizations to develop this equity plan all together. And so as you can imagine, the COVID-19 crisis threw a wrench in our convenings, but also offered us all an opportunity to work even more intently in community engagement for policy change. And I'll say that although there was disruption, of course, I think it's been really inspiring to see how everyone in this very diverse group of people has tried its best to adapt to the situation. And I wanted to give credit, especially to our city representatives, because in times of crisis, it's very easy to resort to top-down approaches and forget about equity and inclusion, and they did the exact opposite. So it took a village to adapt our working group to COVID-19, and everybody has done its part so far. And so I'll start with SPARCC, and they donated our consultant, Maria Zimmerman, to help design and facilitate remote sessions and workshops for the working group. Very important also was the role that our community-based groups and neighborhood-based organizations play, keeping us all accountable, not only to racial equity, but also to what are the community priorities during these times. Metropolitan Planning Council found us a great platform to collaborate called Miro, which creates a virtual whiteboard with tools and space for everyone to contribute. The Elevated Chicago Steering Committee made grants for community-based groups fully flexible, so they could adapt to COVID-19 impact in whatever way they needed to. So if people need to purchase technology, software, cleaning services, whatever that is, the budget is available to be used for those purposes. And then, of course, the City of Chicago, CMAP, CTA, have been very responsive and open to all kinds of accommodations to make this work. And one more thing that I left to the end, but is to me something that we should all lead with, is that to promote community collaboration at this time and to address the amount of uncertainty, stress, inequity that exists right now in communities, we thought it was very important to bring into this project art. So in addition to all of the above, local artist Janelle Nelson has been a great addition to the team in preparing us for virtual workshops and will play a key role the day of and in the final product for this policy plan. So this is my quick summary, Maria. I hope I stick to the 2-3 minutes, and I'm happy to share more during the breakout sessions and hear from you all.
Great, thanks, Roberto. And I also just want to flag, one thing he mentioned that I think is important and will be even more important is how some of our philanthropic partners can help to support some of this work, whether it's around artists or being flexible in resources and all of those things. As I mentioned, we didn't have enough resources for this work beforehand, and I think in a COVID world where resources are even more scarce, how we make the case that these are still worthwhile investments and look for other partners who can also supplement to ensure arts, equity, and accessibility are all key. So I think we're gonna have Justin Merrick, who works with Shay, who will share out with us what's happening in Memphis. So Nick, if you can unmute Justin. And
Justin, I see 3 different CTC Mid-Souths on there. I don't know which one you are.
You just unmuted me.
Okay, great. Can you talk again and make sure I unmuted the right one?
Keep talking, you said?
Yeah, all right, we're good. Cool.
Mic test 1. Okay. So Nick, do you mind putting up one of those slides? Either one. Maybe the line. The one with the arrow. Okay, so CTC is CTC Mid-South, Center for Transforming Communities, and we are the recent backbone in the Memphis work. Our strategic partner with Building Memphis helped to pass the baton over, and one of the things I think is important to frame in context as large is, one, Memphis has been very intentional about doing a bottom-up approach in terms of making sure that there is authentic voice at the tables when helping to do that shared decision making. And so the SPARCC network has really provided, one, the time for there to be a design lab approach and making sure that there is equitable voices at the table. And so CTC's recent transition into this role is, one, making sure that our infrastructure helps to support the work at large for North Memphis. It's a targeted geography of 22 neighborhoods. And so this chart was an evolution of that because it became a major conversation probably around equity over the past 2 or 3 years. But how are we being more intentional about creating an equitable voice at all the tables that exist across the city? And so the SPARCC work is really helping to lift that up. What this chart shows is that often, if you look at the reviews of collective impact, which came out in 2011, which was a model in terms of how there could be cross-sector approach, that a lot of that work from the social justice community was seen as lacking in terms of equitable practices. So what we did is we designed this really cool graph that talks about our organizing model that literally is network organizing into a collective impact so that at the end of the day, there aren't shells. So a lot of times when we think about community organizing, it'll be 1 or 2 representatives from a neighborhood, but that's it. That doesn't mean that there's necessarily an organized voice or body of people of 50, of 100, of 1,000 that they represent. And so it's not necessarily an authentic representation. But ultimately, the idea is at the end of a collective impact, which we kind of see our SPARCC work in terms of resources and institutions and residents coming together as a form of collective impact. And so when that happens, we want to make sure that the neighborhoods that are there are authentically and equitably represented. So with that being said, this is what we're calling the moralizing power line, which for us, that's what equity is how do we moralize power? How is there shared decision making? And so this is a draft, but I wanted to be able to show like some context of where we are in the work. On the y-axis, it simply should just say institutional voice, and on the x-axis, it should say residential voice. And Odetta, shout out to Moralizing Power. It was actually one of our connectors that said that. So we just onboarded about 6 to 8 connectors to help us carry out the work in the neighborhoods. And I don't know if he's on the call or not, but shout outs to Malik. I thought it was pretty dope too, which is why I showed up in this document. So phase 1 would be community building, phase 2 would be organizing, and phase 3 would be community development. We see these as phases and not necessarily linear in time. But one thing that you'll see is that we think of all these phases as concurrently happening, but there's an emphasis right in the building phase. So the building phase will be really just bringing folks together. The organizing phase is how are we getting them on the same page? And the development really speaks to systems. Once they have organized that, how are they functioning within systems? Or if we thought of that through an asset-based community development lens, the building phase will be what can neighbors do for themselves? The organizing phase is what can they do with a little bit of help from each other? And the development phase will be seen as what can they do with help from various institutions. So then that leads into a collective impact, which is design, organize, and sustain, which is stage 4, 5, and 6, which is very similar. Once we've done the network organizing in terms of bringing together different networks that represent the neighborhood, how are all of them sitting at a table with various institutions that have more power probably, right, when we think of the traditional lens of power, and how they are in cooperation and in collaboration with each other. And so that first year can be seen from symmetry from the community building, but in a collective organizing format. The community organizing can be seen in symmetry with the collective impact organizing, and the community development can be seen as the same as collective impact in terms of what it means to then sustain. So with our SPARCC work, we see it at year 4, 5, and 6, or phase 4, 5, and 6, where we are now. And then Nick, if you will switch it, this is just a quick thing because I'm trying to honor the 2 or 3 minute. And of course, this is a quick guide in terms of what it is. Can you go to the other document that I sent you, Nick?
And about 30 seconds left, Justin.
Okay, thank you. So this pyramid shows so that people can more comprehensively understand the place-based community organizing model, which these are evidence things. This is how we think of the work going into the asset-based, which is arts. And we believe that the arts and culture is a connective tissue in terms of making sure that there's authentic voice in the communities. Then that turns into how do we organize various networks in neighborhoods with the ultimate thing that we want to create public policy, some type of shift culturally within how neighbors interact with each other, and some type of economic renewal. And what you will see at the bottom is that the collective transformation guide is, if you were to flip that pyramid over, you would see that we want in every phase to see through a cultural lens, which is how we're building the cultural capacity of neighborhoods, a social lens in terms of how we are building the social capacity, political lens, the political capacity, and the economic lens, economic capital within each of the hubs. So in taking the last 5 seconds that I have, ultimately what this means is that we are reintegrating to make sure that our 22 neighborhoods are represented at the table, but that it's not just a shell, and that we've applied connectors in a series in terms of how residents can work more equitably with institutions. And COVID virtually, quick update on that has been, hey, we started off with a couple of meetings that had 5 people at the beginning, but we're glad to say that we were able to increase that by 250% in the hubs. And so it's been a growing process. And how we integrate arts and culture has been really fun in terms of integrating visual arts facilitation, singing, designing poems around liberation so that we can connect to the work, back to the work in context to COVID and what that means in terms of the gaps that we currently see in the Memphis ecosystem. Thank you.
Cool. Hey, thanks, Justin. And you got a few questions that came in while you're talking. So if you're able to like reply in the chat box to folks, that would be great. We are about to we're about to hear from Nick Hess, who's with the Neighborhood Planning Unit in Atlanta, part of the Atlanta Transformation Alliance. And their team was wanting to spotlight some of the resident-based work that was happening. So we'll turn to Nick. And then I apologize, we're running low on time, so we're not going to have like a formal Q&A. We're just going to take that Q&A into the break. So Nick, we're with you.
Hello and welcome from Atlanta. Just a very brief overview of what the neighborhood planning units are for folks in other cities who haven't heard about us. The NPUs are sort of a uniquely progressive aspect, well, of the city, where they are citizens councils populated by unpaid volunteers such as myself. But anytime that the city is going to do something inside of a neighborhood, if it's a zone neighborhood. Hello?
Yep, you're back.
Yeah, okay. That affects the neighborhood. Oh, great, my internet connection's unstable. Then they have to, by law, run it through the neighborhood planning unit for that area before the city can officially take it up as business. Now, we are advisory only, but it's still a very good leverage point and a point of sort of interaction between the citizens and the city and the city itself. So I like to say that, you know, City Hall is coming to you. So with the COVID challenge, of course, we normally have meetings about, in my NPU, of about 50 people or so. And obviously we couldn't do that, but we have been using Google Meet for the executive committee of my particular NPU. So we extended it, but the challenge is, of course, is how do you have online virtual meetings where, one, you have voting, but two, you have restrictions on who can vote. That's built into our bylaws. And three, we have a population, NPUS is, last time we measured, about 90% people of color. That has changed pretty significantly recently, but still, we have a high percentage of senior citizens, lower income folks, technologically challenged, and phones are what you're gonna get. So how do you do that? And we thought about it carefully, and not only are we holding successful meetings, but we were able to notify the population, our constituency, through push notifications, through reaching out with our neighborhood association partners, so that it wasn't just a thing where somebody had to be online in order to discover where it is. And I will be talking some more about this over in, I'll be talking some more about this over on area 2. And we have put a link on what I call online meeting better practices, and that is inside of the group chat. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Nick. That was super. So we're all learning together here in COVID, and thank you to Justin for stepping up to the plate quickly, for Roberto for his remarks, for Nick, for Shay for showing us that beautiful little child. We have also run into a snafu with what we thought was our really smart polling way of getting folks into their rooms. So like we're all learning together on this. We are going to go into breakouts, and so we're going to move our Q&A time into those breakouts because we're running a little bit behind. Okay. And we apologize. We regret. We actually were not able to put people into the rooms that you had each indicated, because we discovered the poll doesn't let us work that way on the back end of it. So one note, when facilitating meetings, always test all of the technology all of the time. So our apologies for that, but hopefully you feel like any of those are really great conversations, and they're all equally important conversations. So we're going to pivot to that. Time check, we're at 1:54, so we're running a little bit late. I do really want to make sure people have ample time for those conversations. So I'll be checking in with folks virtually in your breakouts, but my inclination is to give you at least 20-25 minutes for those robust conversations. Sometimes report outs are kind of whatever, so we can capture the report out through the notes. We will come back together for a final group gathering, but that's how we're going to work it. So Nick will now work his magic behind. This is a good time if you want to take a little body break or stretch or whatever. You will come back, you will be in a group. We do have facilitators and note takers for each of those groups. That might
not be true anymore.
Well,
I haven't had time to.
We'll make that happen. So if someone's not there when you all get in there and somebody wants to volunteer, we'll sort that all out. So just work with us all. And here we go. Nick, anything else we need to say? Anything for the folks on the phone?
Folks on the phone, you're going to be sorted automatically. I thank you for your patience. I'm sorry that the function didn't work how we intended it, but here we go. Going to hit the magic button.
Okay. Hey folks, welcome back. We're should be all coming back into the main group. So we're a little bit crunched on time, and so I know we also have a lot more attendees than we hoped, so we had a little few more breakout groups than we hoped. So are there one or two groups that really want to share out their responses and what they talked about in the group?
Looks like Marissa, her group, or 4 from her group. I don't know if Nick can figure that out.
I have just allowed people to unmute themselves at this point, so please don't abuse the privilege and make loud noises.
So 4, we'd love to hear from you with group 11.
Awesome. So we talked a lot about virtual engagement, online engagement for communities, and I guess some of the struggles with that. We talked a little bit more about some of the struggles that we're experiencing and some experiences that we've had. Primarily, you know, being under-engaged, people who are already not engaged in community work, in government work, or any of the work that we're doing. Hard to reach voices, communities of color, lower income in particular. Those are the kind of communities that there's a concern around reaching with virtual engagement type of platforms. There's been a few people mentioned, you know, how can we utilize this new world that we're in to actually reach more people, you know, those who are having multiple jobs at home. They can't ever make it to public meetings anyways, because they've got 2 to 3 jobs, or they've got a bunch of kids, you know, they need to feed, or so this could be an opportunity, obviously, for us to reach more people. And I think that trying to focus on that is something that we're talking about, especially at the city and county of Denver. Before this kind of new environment that we're in, these are always things that we talked about, you know, let's have virtual town halls, let's do some more online engagement platforms. But then, you know, we don't really push forward until we have to. So now that we're in this new environment, we've been able to kind of look at these opportunities as a chance to reach more people. And so I think that was actually brought up by somebody in our group now. Also thinking about ways to maybe have different people host the meeting for you would be a great opportunity to try to tap into new community members, or to tap into people who aren't typically involved in the community engagement. Maybe it's a community organization that can host a meeting for you. We had a couple people talk about some other tools. Google Hangouts is one. I just reached out to ask about that to Tim to see kind of what his experience has been with Google Hangouts. But just different platforms, I think, is a way for us to kind of reach more people, and also kind of accommodate those who are, you know, having different issues with technology. So those are some of the conversations that we had in our group.
So it looks like most of the other groups have actually shared out a great synthesis, and, you know, the 1 or 2 things that they're looking for support from national organizations like SPARCC in the chat. So if you felt like you wanted to add anything to that, I'm going to go ahead and share the Google Doc that housed the notes to everyone here, to your group, and just share back some additional pieces, or if there's links or resources you wanted to share but didn't get a chance to, you can go ahead and do that now. And you're also welcome to have it up right after this call, and we'll go ahead and compile this and bring all of these resources into one place, and then share this out after the call. If there are other resources or links or very helpful things that you want to share, please just feel free either to send me or Maria an email, or go ahead and put it in the Google Doc. We really want to capture a lot of the great learning and the wisdom and the resources and the ways that you guys are actually facing barriers, opportunities, and how you're modeling this work during this pandemic time. So I will begin to close us out because we are pretty close on time. I just wanted to offer some gratitude to everyone, both for joining us here and sharing your wisdom. And I know a lot of you guys are very low on capacity and just working very, very hard to address some of the urgent short-term needs, as well as the long-term pressing needs. So we're really grateful for you to joining. I want to also thank our SPARCC sites, our SPARCC partners, the national team, funders, and also a special shout out to Marley and Roberto in Chicago, who shared some of their great slides. Nick, Shay, Justin, I just want to say thanks for you guys being able to highlight some of the great work you do on this call. And I'm going to close us out with a poem. So if everyone just takes a deep breath. It's called Pandemic, but don't be too concerned. It's got a nice ending. What if you thought of it as the Jews considered the Sabbath, the most sacred of times? Cease from travel, cease from buying and selling. Give up, just for now, on trying to make the world different than it is. Sing, pray, touch only those to whom you commit your life. Center down. And when your body has become still, reach out with your heart. Know that we are connected in ways that are terrifying and beautiful. Could hardly deny it now. Know that our lives are in one another's hands. Surely that has become clear. Do not reach out your hands, reach out your heart, reach out your words, reach out all the tendrils of compassion that move invisibly where we cannot touch. Promise this world your love, for better or for worse, in sickness and as health, so long as we shall live. By Lynn Unger, written about the time that we're currently in. So I know we've asked a lot from you guys today with all of the polls and chats, but if you want to stay a moment and we have a poll and an evaluation just so we can kind of learn from all of the learning activities that we've done on this call. We'd also just really appreciate any other additional resources that you want to share, because we really want to use this call to elevate the great work that you guys are doing and learn from the fantastic efforts you're doing right now. And I think we'll close out. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us.
Let everybody unmute so people, wait, I think people can unmute still. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.